So now we are pleased to present our speaker for today's opening ceremony, Professor Michael Dinerstein, an assistant professor in the Kenneth C. Griffin Department of Economics at the University of Chicago. Professor Dinerstein completed his PhD in economics at Stanford University and has done extensive research which has been published in the American Economic Journal. Alongside being one of our speakers, Professor Dinerstein is also one of our presentation judges. But for today, he will be talking to us about the economics of teaching. For example, in this talk, you'll be able to discover how and why allocating existing teachers across schools within a district can affect student achievement. And without further ado, Professor Dinerstein.
Great, thank you very much.
Thank you so much for joining us today, and we really appreciate your time.
Okay, does that look good for everyone?
Yeah, that looks good.
Great, well, I'm really excited to be here. I was very happy to receive the invitation from Jessica and Albert, and I'm excited to spend the next hour with you. I plan to talk for a bit and then have time at the end for a Q&A. At the beginning, I thought I'd tell you a little bit about my background. So without getting too boring in terms of my biography, hopefully some of the details will resonate with some upcoming decisions you all are thinking about. And then I'll get into some recent work of mine that's titled Teacher Labor Market Equilibrium and Student Achievement. Okay, so my background is I went to high school in Maryland a good number of years ago. Just as I'm sure many of you are engaged in lots of extracurriculars like this one, I did a bunch of things when I was in high school. I was on the debate team. I was on Quiz Bowl, which is kind of like the academic trivia of at least at my high school. And then I was on the school newspaper. Interestingly, my high school did not have any standalone economics courses. So I can't tell you if I would have taken them, but there were none for me to take in high school. And so where I wound up actually was not really driven at all by what I was doing when I was in high school. That said, a lot of the other extracurriculars wound up serving me quite well in economics in ways that I might not have been able to predict. So things like debate team, where you have to construct logical and coherent arguments and then respond when someone challenges you on them. That, of course, is very valuable in lots of settings, including trying to argue for an economic point. School newspaper writing, in almost everything you do, writing may not be kind of the primary focus, but winds up being essential in terms of communicating your ideas. And that's certainly true for me as well. And so I got a very good high school education, but interestingly, I was not doing any economics in it. I then went off to college. I started thinking I would do math and philosophy, which sound pretty far apart, although of course are quite linked in terms of their focus on logic. But I certainly had a side of my brain that enjoyed STEM and then also a humanities side. So I sampled a bunch of courses my first year in college, and I would definitely encourage you to do the same if possible. I took humanities ranging from history to kind of political history to art history, poetry. On the STEM side, I took science classes in chemistry, and then I took a bunch of math. But I happened to take Economics 101 midway through my first year of college. And I think within about 2 weeks, I was pretty sure that's what I was going to major in and really do for a career. And for me, at least, the appeal was largely driven by its ability to combine the humanities with kind of the scientific method. We have a lot of focus on models for which understanding the mathematical properties is very helpful. But at the same time, in trying to think about what are the right models of the world, we often appeal to history. And so it's a really nice, I think, synergy between two things we often keep separate. But what really clinched it for me was not just that it was bringing together different skills or type of thinking, but that even from the building blocks of the of the discipline, there's an immediate focus on explaining policies and thinking about what different public policies might be effective. And so really understanding how markets and non-market economic situations work through the lens of policy was extremely appealing to me. And so that's that kind of social science area where you have both the social and the science part, as well as the public policy focus, made it a pretty easy choice for me to focus in economics. I did that for a few years in college. Towards the end, I realized I was going to go to graduate school, and I can tell you about that in a second. But at that point, I started taking much more math, which is where it started. And that's in part because that was necessary preparation for graduate school. So I did a bunch of things during my summers in college, which I also think was very valuable in terms of sampling lots of different things, because it doesn't take too long after college before you all of a sudden have to choose a career path, or at least a starting point. And it's helpful to have a sense of what you're getting into. So I spent the first summer back in the DC area, very close to where I grew up, working for a nonprofit focused on advocacy. So this was really scratching my policy itch. Then I worked as a research assistant for a history professor. So not exactly in the field I ended up in. And I certainly enjoyed the experience. Research assistant jobs are very, I think I sometimes get high school students emailing me about them. So I know they're on at least some of your radars. They become much more common in college. And I definitely encourage if you're thinking about doing research as a career, to try it out as a research assistant. By being kind of the person at the bottom of the team, you certainly will have to do a bunch of data cleaning and stuff like that. And that's what I did. I kind of enjoyed it. And so that was a fairly easy way to know I might be well suited towards research. And I definitely encourage you to consider the same. Then leading into the summer after my junior year of college, I was planning to go back and work in DC again in policy at the US Trade Office. And that fell through at the very last second. And so I had to scramble to find something to do. And I wound up back doing a research assistant job again in economics. And here I was largely transcribing notes in order to make teaching materials for a professor. But again, I just saw more economics in there. And this led me to decide to do a senior thesis and then go to graduate school. So these research assistant jobs, I think, can be very valuable. They're kind of hard. So I was doing these over the summer. If you do them during the school year, they can, of course, be pretty hard to balance with everything else you have going on. But I think it's important to at least start sampling what research is like before you get into it. It's nice in high school and college and even parts of graduate school, you kind of have a clear recipe for what you're supposed to do. And actually completing it with good grades is sometimes hard, but the structure is very clear. It doesn't take too much after that where things all of a sudden get really unstructured. And the more sense you have of what types of things you like, not just in terms of academic disciplines, but even how you think, what types of deadlines you work best with, understanding kind of who you are, I think is very helpful for deciding what you want to do with your professional life. So after college, I worked for a few years, and then I went back to school for graduate school. I studied a bunch of different fields in economics, but all of them are under the umbrella of applied microeconomics. And so the micro part is really studying how individuals or market participants make decisions, as opposed to, say, macroeconomics, which would be studying the whole macroeconomy. And then the applied part, or sometimes you'll hear the word empirical, that implies a focus on understanding the world through data. And so I'm trying to make statements about how the world actually is rather than somewhat more theoretical statements. That said, theory and data, I think, are often combined, and I'll show you an example a little bit in a few minutes of how I do that in my own work. But within this umbrella of applied microeconomics, I've looked at labor economics, which is how labor markets work, public economics, which relates to the government's role in, say, funding public services like education, and then industrial organization, which is focusing on how within an industry, firms compete or fail to compete against each other. And then one of the, I think, biggest advertisements for doing economics, especially research in economics, is that you don't have to be narrow at all. You can learn about all sorts of things in the world. And so even in my fairly short time post PhD, so it's the last almost 7 years, my work has been studying online platforms. So like eBay as an example. I have a whole bunch of work in the economics of education, but within this, I've looked at higher education, K-12 education, public, private, charter education. I've looked at how students make decisions, how teacher labor markets work, and how schools make choices and compete against each other. And then finally, I've also done some work in African agriculture and thinking about the degree of competition there. And not just in my own work, but work I read or interact with, because that's what some of my colleagues are working on. I think it's a really neat way to learn about the world in all sorts of parts of the world. And then think deeply about how the world works and what sorts of changes might be effective in improving people's lives. And so I think economics is a great discipline. My path narrowed, of course, once I decided to go to graduate school. When I was in college at Stanford, there was no undergraduate business major, which meant that economics was pooling together lots of different types of students. So you had a pretty large contingent of people who were on the finance or management consulting track. Not that there was coursework designed to it, but the track, I mean, like they were preparing for that. And so they were getting ready to go into investment banks or something like McKinsey, and eventually probably get an MBA after that. Then I had some classmates who were more on the entrepreneurial side, and they were thinking of starting their own businesses. And so they wanted some economic background to understand how to bring product to market, and so forth. Then you had a bunch of policy people, including people who were planning to work at nonprofits. And so they would potentially, as an example, some classmates would be working on clean water in Africa. And so to understand how you might provide clean water, you need to understand the market system, because a lot of it is provided through markets. And so that's where economics comes in handy. And then the smallest contingent, but the one you probably hear about the most, at least from these types of events, are people who go to graduate school and get into economic research. Even for people who get PhDs, only about half probably, or even less, end up in academic positions where they're doing research. But the others often go into consulting or government or other settings where they're using similar analytical skills. And in fact, many of them are now ending up at tech companies, becoming economists there and working with data analysts. Sometimes there's lots of synergy between what economists are doing and what data science people are doing. But I think there are some differences in terms of a focus on describing the world through causal relationships and so forth. So that's my background. I won't bore you with more of it unless, but if you in Q&A have specific questions, I'd be happy to go into it kind of more length, especially as it relates to types of decisions you're thinking of making. But at this point, I thought I would turn to the research that Jessica mentioned from the beginning. And let me give you a little bit of background about what other people have done first, because that really is essential to understand where we're going. So in this field called the economics of education, one of the biggest focuses has been on trying to figure out how different quality is across school teachers. So here you can think of especially school teachers like in elementary or middle school. And you know, you have a lot of interactions with teachers. Teachers are a pretty big part of what makes a school run. And they switch schools with some regularity. And people become teachers. They often leave the profession. Occasionally they join the profession late in life. And so understanding how much quality varies across teachers is a really fundamental part of thinking about how one might do policy in teacher labor markets. Okay, so the next question is, what does it mean to be high quality? Well, that's a controversial question, or it's a question that can lead to a bunch of debate. And the first part is, well, you want to judge teachers in terms of how their students learn. And the question is, how do we measure learning or just proficiency in things? And so today, and in much of the academic work, I'm going to focus on test score measures as describing how well students are doing. That's, of course, a very incomplete measure because lots of skills one picks up, maybe non-cognitive skills, are not always reflected on tests. So it's certainly not a catch-all measure. It also, of course, has other issues in that you might be able to manipulate things or target tests in a way that doesn't necessarily reflect real learning. So you might have things like the teaching to the test type concerns, where maybe some students are getting high test scores, but it's not that they're necessarily learning a lot. But researchers have done a lot of work to try to validate that test score measures do seem to relate quite closely to later outcomes in life that we think are pretty helpful, like satisfaction with your life, with your job, earnings, and so forth. Okay, so then the next question is, okay, if we want to measure a teacher's effect on students' test scores, how do we do that? And economists have converged on this notion called value added. Now, the value part's not so interesting, but the added part is pretty important. So here, I want you to think about helping students learn relative to some benchmark. Now, I came from a high school in Maryland that was quite well resourced and had a fairly wealthy area. So the students came into high school already knowing a lot of things, right? A lot of people had already taken algebra, which is not true throughout the country. Some had even taken geometry and so forth. And so it would be a little bit odd to say, oh, the students at this high school do really well on tests, therefore their teachers must be amazing. Now they may be amazing, but we can't be sure because the students already started high school knowing a ton of stuff. And so there's a huge amount of selection or sorting of students to high school. And at least in the US, this is really strong because a lot of school attendance is determined by where you live. And as you can probably tell from your local communities, where you live is certainly not random. And there's lots of kind of sorting based on income levels and so forth. So the added part is essential because we want to say relative to a kind of regular teacher, how much does this teacher change students' outcomes, where we're adjusting for some students are going to have good outcomes regardless. And so academic research is really focused on trying to measure different characteristics that explain student selection. Things like if I can control for students' test scores last year, then that's any gains on top of that, I think I could potentially more credibly attribute to the teacher, him or herself. Okay, so there's this whole literature around estimating teacher value added. And one of the conclusions that's been found pretty consistently within this literature is that there is a lot of dispersion. There are some really good teachers and some teachers who are not so effective. And so this implies that it's really valuable if you can get good teachers in your school and in your classroom. And if you have underperforming teachers, there could be big gains from replacing them. And so a big focus in policy circles from this research has been replacing low-performing teachers. Okay, in this work today, I'm going to talk about some other ways teachers might matter that would actually generate different policy recommendations. Instead of thinking about who gets to become a teacher in a school district, there are several ways in which assigning teachers to a different school within the same school district might be pretty important. So the first is what I'll call match effects. This is the notion that some teachers are particularly effective with certain types of students. So take students, say, from difficult backgrounds with maybe slightly unstable home situations. There might be some teachers who are particularly effective at identifying with that type of situation and may be able to reach the student much better. Whereas other teachers might be good teachers, but that type of experience may not line up with what they've had in life. And so they may not reach the student as well. And so you may have some teachers who are good with certain student types. And then we would want to sort those teachers to have those types of students in front of them. The second is a little bit more basic, which is that if you have a lot of variation in class size, then you might want to put the best teachers in the biggest classes because they can affect more students. Okay, so these could be reasons why we don't necessarily need to replace low performing teachers, but just changing, kind of mixing where teachers are assigned could be a pretty big deal. So that's the starting point for this research. Of course, it's one thing to say you would like to reassign teachers. It's a very different one to say, how are you going to do that? In part because most school districts can't just tell a teacher, you must teach at this location. Teachers instead have preferences over where they would like to teach, right? Even the teacher, say, who's particularly effective reaching out to a low performing student may find that more challenging or tiring work. And so there may be reasons why he or she might, do that for a few years, but then decide she'd like to switch to a different school. And some districts can control a little bit about where you're allowed to switch. But of course, teachers can always decide to not be teachers or leave the district. And so this notion that teachers have preferences is going to be really essential for how we think about whether we can achieve the types of gains from match effects and sorting based on class size. Now, in many settings, having preferences over your job or what you do, or the type of major you have or so forth, is very common. We would expect that guides most decisions. But in cases where there's kind of systematic preferences away from certain options, like this school is hard to staff, then often compensation might be what we'd turn to, right? We'd say, okay, this job is not particularly desired by people, but it's really important we have someone good in it. So let's pay people a lot of money to do it. And that might, that payment might have a very high return. But like many public employee settings, teachers in public schools in the United States and really around the world face very rigid salary schedules. This means that teachers are not compensated for financially for unfavorable assignments. Teacher salaries tend to vary only with the teacher's level of experience and the teacher's level of education. For instance, does she have a master's degree? But both of those things don't suddenly change if you switch schools, right? They're a feature of you as the teacher, not of the position. And so in that sense, a given teacher doesn't receive any financial compensation from switching within a school district. Thus, these preferences that exist in many settings may be really important for determining where teachers end up here because there's nothing working against it. There's no compensation to counteract people's preferences away from certain schools. And so without any salary variation, what we're going to get a set of teacher assignments that are combining a few things: teachers' preferences over amenities instead of, say, salary; principals' preferences, because principals can decide who they hire; and then also things like how the market works, when you look for jobs, and timing.
Professor Dinnerstein, I just wanted to interrupt real quick. I think there might be a lag between the presentation slides and like what we're seeing. Not sure. So
okay, which slide do you see?
Right now, I see, I think maybe the first slide.
Oh,
yeah.
I'm sorry. Okay, let me try again.
Okay. Okay, now I see it.
Okay, I'm really sorry about that. So I think probably my biography part was
yeah, that part I think we all got, yeah.
Let me just I'll review for a minute and then, but thanks for letting me know, Jessica.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. So I mentioned that there's one policy, which is replace low performing teachers. Instead, if you think that match effects or differential class sizes are a big deal, then the other policy, which we'll call within district assignment of teachers, could be important. Okay, so you might think of two types of policies that would be relevant. And then what I just mentioned is that teachers have preferences over assignments, but that the salary schedules are rigid. And so they don't necessarily counteract systematic preferences. And so in summary, the assignment of teachers is going to reflect a combination of where teachers want to work who principals want to hire because they have some choice over which teachers to put in their classrooms. And then other features of the market, like timing, when teachers and principals are jointly searching for a new assignment, and so forth. Okay, so we are going to try to understand how this market works. First, we're going to look at what actually happens in real life and try to figure out features of these preferences. It's one thing to say preferences matter, but their exact form, like what do teachers like or dislike, is going to be pretty relevant for thinking about how the market works. Once we then understand how the market works, we can then think about the possible effectiveness of policy changes, and whether they would lead to more student learning. So I'll give you a few more details later, but we're going to look at a teacher labor market in the state of North Carolina. And in this labor market, in the spring of the prior year, so from April, actually through the summer, so April to August, principals have some sense of how many open positions they have. So a principal might know, oh, I have a teacher retiring, or a teacher going on maternity leave or an extended leave, or I have more enrollment at my school than I did the year before. And so they know, oh, I need to hire a new teacher or several new teachers for this coming year. And they don't wait until August 30th when the school year starts to hire. They hire someone the prior spring, and so they can then line up a good teacher, and that teacher would start in August or September. So the market generally works the following spring, and it's a rolling market. So it's decentralized in that teachers apply to jobs. Principals receive a bunch of applications from teachers, and then they look at, oh, I like this teacher or these few teachers, and they choose who to interview. And if the interview goes well, they might make a job offer. This is not so dissimilar, say, from the college admissions market that many of you will go into soon. That is also decentralized in that you can choose where to apply. The schools will then collect all of the applications you all send them, and they'll choose who to, some of them do interviews, and then they'll choose who to admit. The key difference, though, is that for the most part, the college market has coordinated timing. So at least like if we focus on the regular decision round, most schools wouldn't basically require you to choose before the end of April. Whereas in this labor market, if the principal gives you a job offer, you can't collect all of your offers and say, I'm going to decide at the end of April which one I'm going to do. You have to basically respond immediately. So we call these sometimes like exploding offers. So it would say, suppose you applied to Stanford and they said you're admitted, but you have to choose within 24 hours. And you don't know if you got into Berkeley or one of your other options. So it's pretty similar to the college admissions process, but that's the key distinction. The other distinction, I guess, is that in college admissions, often you get financial aid packages, and they may vary by school. Schools might give different individuals different financial aid packages. Here with teaching, as I mentioned, the wages or the salary do not vary with the assignment. Okay, so in order to try to understand what's happening as well as make predictions, we're going to specify in this work an economic model of this labor market. I won't really get into what it is in today's presentation, but the goal of the model will be to predict how teacher-school assignments are formed. How does a given teacher end up working at a school? And then we'll want to understand what is the value of each assignment, right? Is this teacher really a really good match for this school? Is she likely to succeed? Or is it a really poor match? And so in the model, we have different agents, school principals who make hiring decisions, and school teachers who choose where to apply. And then we care about how much learning there is for students as represented by their test scores. And then we might also care about how happy teachers are with their assignments. And then this is certainly beyond what you're familiar with, but we have to have some notion of an equilibrium concept, which is this idea that markets exist or like produce equilibria. And we need to be able to define properties of that, of what an equilibrium would be in order to make predictions about what might happen. Okay, so I'll just summarize what we had before, but the output of a model, or the point of a model, is that we are able to show how a teacher assignment or allocation depends on what the teachers like, their preferences, what the principals like, their preferences, the timing of the market, and then there might be some role for equilibrium selection. The goal of our work is to understand what the relative influence of these factors are. How much do we see teachers in certain schools because that's where they like to teach? Or how much are they there instead because that's the choice the principal made? And we want to understand these separately because the suggested policy varies a lot depending on which of these is a big deal. So if I think the reason why we are not reaching our potential in terms of what we could have for student learning is because teachers are choosing positions that are not the best match. We're not ending up with the teachers matched towards the students they're most suited to teach. Then I might want to give out bonuses to teachers. So I might say, I'll look at the teacher's VA, which is value added, and I'll give them compensation for the test scores their students are getting. While I said such compensation doesn't usually exist, some districts have started to experiment with it. And so it's a fairly reasonable policy. Second, maybe teachers are choosing schools where they're most effective, but principals just aren't noticing the right teachers. They're hiring in a way that's not the most effective. And so in that case, you might want to give principals bonuses to hire the teacher who would produce the highest value added. Or maybe you might give principals guidance on hiring. And then if timing is a big deal, you might try to coordinate the market like we have for college admissions. So you might try to get all the offers to be made nearly simultaneously so that teachers can choose among them. And then there are a few other kind of remaining policies. And so our goal is to understand the relative influence of the things on the left-hand side of this, because they will speak to what is most likely to be effective on the right-hand side. Okay, now to do that, we had a model, but as I said, I'm an applied or empirical microeconomist. And this is in part because I really think it's important to learn about the world through data. And so a lot of this work really relies on getting really high quality data that can let you understand features of preferences. And so some data that we think is fairly novel for our study is that we have all of the application and vacancy data. So this labor market I've described, sometimes it's kind of hidden to the researcher, right? For you, for instance, when you see your teachers in your classroom, you don't really know how she got there. You don't know what other positions he or she might have been considering and so forth. And often the researcher doesn't know as well, but we have data from a large urban school district in North Carolina going back almost a decade. We see things like who applied where, who the principal interviewed, who they hired, how they rated applications. And these types of actions, which are teachers choosing where to apply and principals saying who they like, these are pretty closely tied to expressing preferences, right? Sometimes we have preferences, but it's kind of hard to see their effect directly. But in this case, we see actions that are really closely tied to them. And so it's going to, we think, give us much more credible characterizations of preferences than you might usually see. That's preferences though, and we want to understand how they relate to teacher effectiveness. And so for that, we're going to need to link the teachers to data on you all, students, as well as data on the teachers themselves, and to know which students are in which teachers' classrooms. So for here, we have data going back to 2007 in the same state, North Carolina. And we know some things about the students, like their demographics. The outcome we'll use is math test scores. And then for teachers, we know things like their experience, their demographics, and which classroom they were assigned to. Our focus in the research is going to be on elementary schools for two main reasons. One is that the tests that students take in elementary school are much more standardized. For instance, by the time you get to high school, you might be taking the same test, but in different grades, or tests are really subject specific. And so it's much harder to compare students on the same test. Sometimes things like the SAT or ACT are fairly effective comparison tools. But even there, some students don't take those tests. And especially, for instance, in schools where we think it might be hardest to find good teachers. And so we focus on students taking tests in grades 3 through 5. And then the other reason we focus on elementary schools is that the teacher labor market is much better defined. Whereas in high school, it's kind of specific to the subject. You might be a math teacher, but there's some ability to maybe do multiple things. And so it's harder to know which positions a teacher is eligible for. So a lot of the research, in fact, in terms of time, probably 80% of our work was about this slide, trying to get good data and cultivating relationships with the school district so they would give us the data, and then getting the data and making sure it can be merged in all of these steps that data analysis requires. And then you get a bunch of results which form the heart of most of what you talk about, but really all of the time is spent in this section. Okay, I'm going to show you something now, which it's completely not essential if you understand. I'm just going to give you a sense of what goes into a model, but it's if this makes no sense, don't worry about it. Essentially, we're trying to get a measure of how effective a teacher is going to be. So here, teachers are going to have J as your subscript. So if I have a different J, that means that's a different teacher. Year is T, and then student type, and we're going to think of advantaged or disadvantaged students, is going to be M. So this thing in the middle here is what we're really after. This is going to be the teacher's quality, teacher J's quality, with a specific type of student in year T. But as I mentioned before, we're a little bit worried that students' test scores reflect a lot of other things that might be sorted, that students might be sorted on. So we're going to have a model where the left-hand side of the outcome is a test score. And then we acknowledge that students have lots of things that make them different from each other. And these are going to be wrapped up in the X, in an X vector. Okay, so we're going to have lots of variables that we see in our data that characterize how students differ from each other independent of the teacher they're assigned to. And so in particular, we're going to use their prior test scores as ways to kind of control for differences across students. Then we're going to say, well, teachers differ not just in terms of quality, but experience. So Z is going to be a variable that we have for teacher experience. And you see in lots of analysis that teachers tend to get better with experience. And then we're going to have some extra things on the end. I wouldn't worry too much about these, but these are measures of a school or a year. So you might say, oh, this school's test scores are really high, but it's not clear if that's, and the students were not selected coming in, but maybe that's that the principal's just a great principal. And the teachers are do well because of the principal, but if they went to a different school, they wouldn't be as effective. And so these are the types of things we're trying to control for. But again, no worries if this goes over your head a little bit. I want to now show you, I'm going to skip this, but I'm going to show you a little bit more details about the application process, and then I'll show you some results. So I mentioned before some high-level details about how the market works, but in real life, how teachers get into schools, at least in North Carolina, are principals post a vacancy when they learn a position is open. Then teachers who are already in the district have a 1-week head start to apply for the job. After that 1 week, anyone who's a potential teacher or teaching elsewhere at the moment can choose to apply for the job. They must apply on an online platform that's centralized, kind of like the Common App for You. So basically you upload a single set of materials and it gets sent everywhere that you would like it to, but you get to choose where you send it. And then the schools, in your case, or here, the principals will review and rate the applications. And then they make an interview and they make offers on a rolling basis. And the offers explode within 24 hours. So a teacher receives an offer and then she has to say yes or no within a day. Okay, so we have all of the data from this application system. And let me just show you some patterns we see before I show you how we put them together. So I'm going to show you several graphs that look very similar. The x-axis is going to be some characteristic of the position. So here it's commute time in minutes. So a 10 is 10, this position here takes the teacher 10 minutes on average to drive from her house to the school. The y-axis is going to be a measure of how much the teachers like the position. This is something we infer from the application decisions. So 100 is going to be like their favorite position. It's the 100th percentile. 0 is their least favorite. So you'll see here there's a negative slope, right? And this is because the closest positions, the ones far left on the x-axis, are among the most preferred. So we find that teachers really don't want to commute too far. Okay? That's nothing terribly surprising, but it's a pretty strong relationship. What else? Well, we can look at the types of students who are at a school. So this is the fraction of students who are economically disadvantaged, which in the data reflects are the students qualifying for free or reduced price school lunch. So to the far right is a school where every student qualifies. So this would be a relatively lower income school on the far right. The far left is a fairly high income school. And you can see, again, a negative slope. Teachers are applying much more to schools in the higher income area. But it doesn't explain everything. This is a bit of a flatter slope. It doesn't mean that there are no teachers applying to the lower income schools. It just means that on average, those schools receive fewer applications. The next thing is I'm going to look at a measure of how effective a teacher would be at a given school. So far right are teachers who would be very good at a school. Far left is teachers who we think would be not very effective at a school. And here we see basically no relationship, like a flat line. So teachers do not tend to apply to places they would be particularly effective. Instead, it's features like the commute time or the student characteristics that seem to matter more. We can then turn around the analysis, and instead of thinking about how are teachers acting and what are their preferences, we can look at how principals are acting in their hiring decisions. So here I'm going to have the same x-axis I just did, which is how effective a teacher would be. But the y-axis is now, instead of being how much a teacher likes a position, it's going to be how much a principal likes a teacher. So 100 is the principal's favorite teacher. 0 is least favorite. And here you see that principals do seem to be favoring teachers towards the far right, which is teachers who are likely to be more effective. But again, it doesn't completely explain everything, but it's fairly encouraging about what principals are looking for. Okay, so these are some features of how principals and teachers are acting. We then put them together in our model to make statements about policies. So I'm going to show you, I'll end on this type of figure, but let me explain it to you in some detail so you really understand what's going on. On the x-axis is a measure of teacher utility, which is like how much teachers like their assignment. The units are commute time. So 40 is like, I'm reducing commute time. So 40 makes them quite happy, 0 less happy. The y-axis is student test scores. So the top part of the y-axis is higher test scores. The bottom is lower test scores. So we'd love to be in the top right of this picture. Teachers and students are both happy. But you can't automatically get there because you can't make the best teacher teach every student, for instance. So the black line here is something we call the PPF, which is in economics terminology, a production possibilities frontier. But that basically shows you what you could get, what's feasible. We may not be able to get here because teachers may not want to go there, but this is in principle how much we could achieve if we could move teachers wherever we wanted. This top left part is the one that's best for students. This is like the highest point on the black line. And the bottom right part is the one that's best for teachers because that's the farthest right point on the black line. Okay. Now we're going to think about though where we actually are. So the first thing we do is we measure the status quo, and it's down here. So this is looking at where teachers are actually assigned in our data. And you'll note that this is well within this black area. So there are lots of, if we could move this point farther to the right, teachers would be happier. If we could move this point farther up, students would be happier. And there are big gains that might be out there. It's not, if the point already was on the black line, we'd say, oh, like we're already doing as best as we possibly could. The market's working really well. But the fact that it's not close to the black line means that we potentially could improve a lot of things. So we can use our model as well as the data that we had to make a few statements about what we think various policies would do. The first one I'll talk about is complete market coordination. So maybe the issue is this rolling thing, which is there are these 24-hour offers. And so a bunch of teachers get an offer in April and they take it because they don't want to miss out. But in fact, they'd be great matches for jobs that are not even posted until May or June. And so if we could somehow force them all to coordinate and have a single date in which offers are accepted, like the college admissions market, at least in the regular round, then maybe that'll produce some gains. And that's what we simulate here with the red text. So this dot is farther to the right, so teachers are happier, and it's farther up, so students are happier. But we aren't too close to the black line, especially on the vertical space. So there's still more room to improve. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is we're going to give principals bonuses for hiring the best teachers. When we do that, we actually make teachers happier. You see this third point is farther to the right, so teachers are happier. But it's actually down pretty low on the x-axis, y-axis still. So students are not much better off. So principals hiring the best teachers doesn't necessarily help. This is a bit counterintuitive, but this is largely driven by the fact that if all the principals hire the best or want to hire the best teachers, they're going to all go for the same teacher. And that doesn't necessarily guarantee they'll end up with the one who's best suited for them. Okay, I'll end by showing you one more point. And this is what happens if we give teachers compensation based on the value added they produce. And here we go all the way up to this top left point. Now the teachers are much worse off, although they get compensated for it, so they may still be happy. But on the y-axis, we've gone way up. We're much closer to this black line than we were way down here with these other points. And so giving teachers bonuses based on the amount of output they produce seems to be the most effective policy in terms of getting student test score gains. And there are lots of details in the background of these types of statements. It requires a model and some data and lots of careful steps, but that's kind of the main result of the analysis. So I'm now 45 minutes in. I apologize for the slides at the beginning, but I thought I'd pause here so we could kind of finish with a bunch of questions about this or about my biography at the beginning. I see some in Q&A, but Jessica, you should let me know whether you want me to choose or if you want to answer or ask.
Yeah, I think we can go along with the Q&A in there, and I will, let's see. I can pick out the questions. Okay, so we can go from the top. And just wanted to say, first of all, that yeah, thank you for this whole presentation. And I think that your explanation overall was really thorough, so thank you for that. And we have a question that's kind of unrelated, but what would you say is the thing that gets you up every morning?
Yeah. So one nice thing is, like, in this profession, you don't really, in my academia, you don't really have a boss. And so you can kind of choose what you study. It's an incredible amount of freedom. Of course, sometimes bosses are helpful. And so by having the freedom to choose what I want to study, I think what gets me motivated is learning about the world. And so you come into projects and you just look at this project, for instance, these 4 dots. Before the project started, I wouldn't have known where to put them. And so you think hard about them and you think, oh, if a dot is farther up on the y-axis, that's really helpful to students. So this matters. This is something that helps people in the world, but I need to do the research and get good data and understand how things work in order to figure out where these dots lie. And so there's kind of like a mystery and uncertainty about how things actually work that I think that economics can clarify. And so for me, it's learning about the world and about things I think that matter in the world. Now that's a very, a very, some days are harder you have other things you have to do. You're doing lots of like administrative work and so forth. So it's not to say that every day is like waking up and working on your favorite problem in the world. But I love the freedom to do that. And I think that's fairly rare.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think like this whole thing where you can just find answers to your own questions is honestly pretty interesting. And you would say that it gives you a pretty good sense of like fulfillment, right? And achievement.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think some people want to choose their questions and some people like working within a bigger structure. So something I miss out on is I don't have as much teamwork as I might if I worked at a big company, right? But this freedom to really work on what you find interesting is really valuable.
I see. Yeah, and we have another question on your background. It says,
Yeah.
You said you were interested in math and philosophy and went on to take many high-level math courses. I was wondering what you have to say about the usefulness of statistics courses for economic learning as compared to math. Are they both subjects that provide an equal support for an economics student, or do you think there is a significant difference? If you have any class recommendations for math for statistics at the undergraduate level, I would really enjoy hearing of that as well. Yeah, so that was one of your questions.
Absolutely. I think it's key probably so if you can do economics without math. If you want to do graduate level economics or kind of be on that path, or maybe find the undergraduate economics courses easier, math is more essential. Math versus statistics. I tend to think both are really helpful. A combination is probably best, but in statistics, classes like probability theory are, I think, very valuable. And so in terms of economics, modeling economic behavior is typically a little bit more tied towards math, especially like calculus. So we think of trying to say, why is someone doing something? Well, the why is really an optimization problem. They chose to do this. And that sounds a lot like what you might find in calculus. But understanding, trying to make statements with data, that often requires a lot of statistics. In fact, what we call it econometrics, which is the combination of economic models with statistics. And so statistical training, starting from probability theory to like things like central limit theorem, law of large numbers, kind of the standard statistics sequence, I think serves you really well in life regardless, but especially if you go into economics.
I see. Okay. And then we have some more questions. I'll be jumping around a bit because yeah, I feel that some of them might be slightly more relevant. This one is related to your presentation. So how do we measure the value added for students? Is that what you were getting at with the student achievement formula?
Yes, very good question. It's mostly tied up in this formula. So I'm going to say the student outcome here, their achievement, depends on a lot of factors. Some I want to call a teacher's value added, but some I don't. I don't think they're like part of the teacher. So I'm going to say, well, okay, this depends on some student things, which is the X part, some school things, which is this K thing, some year things, maybe like a COVID shock, like that every student's test scores go down, but that doesn't mean the teachers were bad. That's a T. And some classroom things like, oh, this is just a classroom, everyone gets along well. This middle one, this mu, is the teacher's effect, which I'll call value added. So this equation is really about trying to isolate the teacher's effect by controlling for the other things in here. So what you wind up doing is you run a regression essentially, which is you would also see if you took statistics classes, so another advertisement for statistics or econometrics. And basically you try to explain variation in the left-hand side with how things moved at the same time on the right-hand side. And so if I can control for other things on the right-hand side, whatever's left over for the teacher part, I'm going to say, okay, this is the teacher's effect. And I'm willing to call that value added because I've controlled for things like students' characteristics in X. It winds up being a little bit more sophisticated than this, but this is really like the logic behind the calculation.
I see. Yeah, I once heard about something called like differences and differences. I don't know if it's that, but like, yeah, manipulating a lot of like these different factors seems kind of complex, but yeah, the results are interesting.
Difference and difference winds up being a slightly different thing, but it's also, there's a lot of intuition behind that as well.
I see. Yeah, and there's another question here. How do you assign values and quantities to each one, with like each one being so kind of arbitrary?
Yeah, so basically, we actually go back to statistics and say we can reliably assign values or to things if we have a large enough sample. So the reliability part is like, if I see a teacher teach one student and that student's amazing, it's like a math Olympiad student, I'd be a little bit nervous about saying that that was the teacher's doing, because that's kind of just one observation. Maybe there was something random there. So you wind up wanting lots of data in order to say, I've seen this teacher with a whole bunch of students, and the students consistently do well. And so I use a lot of data then to not just control for other things like the students' characteristics, the school, but also just so I know enough about the teacher. Then if you go to these things, how do I make statements like teachers don't want to travel far? I mean, that's not the most controversial statement, but you still, like, exactly how much it matters is hard to know until you see data. Well, I want to see a teacher have lots of cases where she's telling me things about how much she disliked travel. So I would look in the transfer system and I'd say, look at all these positions she could have tried to transfer to. She had 100 different jobs she could have done. She applied to 10. And then you say, well, what is it about those 10? And with statistical methods, but kind of the intuition is that, oh, those 10s are like the closest ones to where they live. And so because repeatedly I see the one she chooses as a close by one, I start to basically be able to put measures on how much she dislikes commuting.
I see. And kind of similarly, another like factor in the equation that one of our attendees mentioned wasn't like present, I guess. So is parental background factored into it? And if so, how would it be quantified?
Yeah, that is a great question. It's kind of at best implicit. So the problem is most school districts don't collect detailed data on parental background. They may, at times, you may fill out surveys where that's given, but they don't, the rest of the government may have a better sense of parental background, but the school system itself doesn't usually collect a lot of information. What that means is that we understand that parental background is a very big deal and one of the main things you want to control for. And so the hope is that other controls wind up implicitly capturing differences in parental background. For instance, lag test scores is the big one. So if parental background, so let's think about a fifth grader. If parental background meant the fifth graders' fourth grade scores are really good, then if I control for their fourth grade scores, I'm kind of controlling for parental background naturally. But some people push back and say maybe it's not the most effective control. And so there's lots of discussion around that. But even though it's not in here directly, the idea would be it's sort of captured by other things in here. And it's absolutely one of the most important factors.
I see. And there's another question. How could we expand the production possibilities frontier you discussed to allow for even better outcomes in the future? So I guess this kind of ties into the above question also. So what would like be some final thoughts or solutions other than like what you've previously mentioned, I guess?
Yeah, so let me return back to the beginning, which is when the slides weren't working. But there were sort of two, I said, well, the first thing you could do is you could replace low performing teachers. Or the second thing that you could do is you could keep the same set of teachers you already have and change how they're reassigned. This exercise here is really the second thing, which is saying, let's fix a set of teachers. The kind of by definition, the best we could do is this Black production possibilities frontier. So in some ways, it's like, at least for reassigning teachers, by definition, there's nothing you can do better than the Black line. But that's just because we said we have a fixed set of teachers. And so you might return to the first type of policy, and the way to shift the production possibilities frontier out would be change even who the teachers are in the district. So you could think of these two things, even though I said they're different policies, they could work together, right? You could say, well, sometimes I'll do things that shift out what's possible by moving the Black line out. But then other times, it's not very valuable to me if I shift the Black line, if I'm stuck at this point down here. It just means like, oh, this is what I get down here. But there are more things I could have gotten that I'm not getting. Eventually, if you shift the Black line out more, and you have policies that move you closer to the Black line, that could be a really nice combination.
Yeah, I see. So basically, like, giving teachers like raises would help with both, right?
That's a good point. So you could say, if we pay teachers more, just generally, then we might get more people wanting to become teachers, and then you could shift the Black line out more. Then you could say, well, let's just not just pay them more, let's pay them more specifically at where they would be most effective. And then you'd say, oh, we're not just shifting out the line because we have more teachers and maybe some better teachers, but we're also finding ways such that they move towards schools where they're most effective.
I see. That's pretty interesting. And we have another question in here. I know that you did your research based on one school district, right? But it says, have you found that a certain type of school has been more successful in the way they handle students and faculty? And based on that, do you think more resources should be allocated to the school that has been more successful, or put resources into fixing the schools that have been less successful?
Yeah, that's a really fantastic question. I don't have I'm not sure which side's better. There are schools that have proven to be more successful. In the test score space, there are certain charter schools, for instance, which are not what I talked about today, but charter schools in urban areas that have gotten really large test score gains for their students. And it seems to be not just about test scores, but other things too. They're also within the public school system. There's some schools that consistently do really well. And then it's a really open question, and one that's really needs a lot of research to understand. Should we reward schools that are doing it well? Or should we give more resources to schools that aren't, because maybe they aren't doing it well because they're missing resources? It probably depends on the case. I tend to think there are lots of, one way we could give schools more resources or reward successful schools is find ways to almost like replicate them. And so it's one thing to say, oh, this school's doing really well, let's make it even better. But as long as it's located on some block in the city, and no one's going to travel 30 miles to go to this school, you're kind of limited. And even if the school's amazing, it will really only affect the local kids. And so the best ways we might get improvements is if we take models of schools that are really effective, and we find ways to open more campuses of those types of schools. Now that means kind of you have to replicate what you've already done and been successful with. So if it's a magic formula that you can't totally describe, it's hard to know how to redo it. But sometimes we see certain things like longer school days, which you all may not love, but in urban settings, especially those have been very successful. Techniques that are a bit more data-driven. So principals looking at teachers based on how well they've been in terms of data rather than classroom observation. Those seem to be policies that tend to be effective. So I would tend to think that places that are struggling, we certainly want to give them resources because you don't want those that might compensate for the fact that they're struggling. But the kind of one of the best strategies is to find ways to reward successful schools, but almost by duplicating them as new campuses.
I see. And I think we'll wrap it up with like 2 or 3 more questions, but this also ties into the question from before. How do you hope that this project will overall impact public policy?
Sure. So one aspect of trying to get the data and working with the school district to get the data is you actually form a fairly tight research policymaker partnership. And so in that sense, we are kind of in a lucky situation where the school district that we've been talking to is, very interested by our results and thinking of acting upon them. The school district has been very focused on this version, which is coordinating the market, basically having all offers come out at the same time. We kind of tell them, that might be good. It helps. It's not going in the wrong direction, but the extent to which that requires a lot of resources or changing how the market works, that may not be your highest return use of your resources. So that's actually a case where we're kind of doing policy suggestions by saying, don't do something, instead focus on other things. The next thing is this one down here was something about paying principals for output or value added. In our setting, the state of North Carolina just started doing this. And we say, oh, that's okay, but it doesn't really help things. The one they haven't considered yet is the one way up here. And so in some ways, our policy suggestions are really the things you're doing might have small gains, but they're kind of, the more you can focus on teacher bonuses, especially for teaching in poorer schools, we think those are much more effective than working to, say, coordinate the market. So that's kind of an example of taking these results and having kind of policymakers' ears and giving them suggestions about where to focus. Now, we're not going to, policymakers have lots of constraints too that we don't necessarily consider in this work. And so we wouldn't necessarily assume that all of our recommendations are taken, but the discussions so far have been very fruitful.
I see. And let's see, I think we have a few more questions here. So do you feel that there needs to be a substantial shift in the US housing market to narrow the gap in quality of facilities such as schools, community centers, and other infrastructure between low income and high income families, and if how so?
Yes, so the background behind this is we've sort of kept the housing or residential sorting as they are. And everything I've talked about today has been, what do you do on top of that? But the residential sorting is a really big deal. In education in the US, there's been a movement the last 20 or 30 years to make funding of schools less local. So it used to be that funding was primarily determined by local property taxes. And so the wealthier area you are, the more money you have to spend on schools. There's certain rationales why that might make sense, but it does lead to a very unequal situation. And so over the last 30 years or so, there have been some lawsuits, and often states, like Supreme Courts at the state level, have often decided that the state should centralize more of the funding. So they collect all of the revenue, bring it to the state, and then they give it out at the state level. So that has equalized funding much more than it could have been in the past. And we've seen a lot of that money being used in lower income areas to improve things like school infrastructure. That said, I think, but there still is a big difference. And a lot of it is some of the lower income areas have they're subject to people leaving much more. And so you have some schools that don't get maintained as much, or they aren't full. And so we do have somewhat of an infrastructure problem, especially in low income areas. And sometimes it's that we have too much infrastructure. But when you have too much, you then may not replace it. And so the buildings kind of get old and depreciated. But I would say that a lot of economists have found that, at least in terms of student learning, which is just one outcome, but student learning based on test scores, things like teachers and spending on teachers is a much bigger deal than the quality of the building.
Yeah, definitely. That is definitely something that I think most of us would agree with too. Yeah. And I think we can wrap it up with one last question. And this question is more general, I guess. So what do you do on a day-to-day basis as a professor?
Yeah. Okay, so we have, so my job responsibilities, the primary one is to do research. Now, research can be all sorts of things depending on the project and depending on where we are in the project. So it could be, I'm calling the school district to see if they'll work with us to give us data. It could be, we just got data and we're trying to understand how it's structured. What do these variables mean? Why are there some confusing data points and so forth? It could be, we've already done that, but now we're trying to think about, well, how do we measure what teachers like? Or it could be putting this all together here in like a model. So all of those things, obviously, like because this project exists, I had to do them all at some point. Any given day, I'm probably balancing 2 or 3 projects that are current, but at different stages. So there's a bit of it's a lot of freedom, but it's a lot of balancing different ideas in one's mind and knowing when to like focus on the tedious parts versus the high level thinking. In total, the research probably takes half of my day on average. You know, some days complete, some days not. The rest of my time is spent in a mix of teaching. So teaching undergraduate and graduate students. This is, lecturing, designing evaluations like tests, grading, and so forth. I also advise students both at the undergraduate and graduate level. So this involves meeting with students. For our graduate students, we're trying to get them into become faculty members. So advising them on their research, talking about how they could improve their work. For undergraduates, there's a little bit of that, but sometimes it's more advising them about their career, but maybe if they're writing a senior thesis, advising them on that. And then there's a variety of just kind of departmental responsibilities. While I don't admit undergrads because that's done through the undergraduate admissions office, graduate admissions for our PhD programs or master's programs are all at the departments. They admit their own. So I'm involved with admissions there. And then there's lots of, and then sometimes you might have research assistants working for you. So you're also reaching out to them and discussing how it's going, or maybe even hiring someone. And so in some ways you're a little bit of running your own business a little bit, where the output is economic research. And some days you're doing kind of the core function, the research part, but often you're also kind of maintaining the other parts. And then of course, what you probably think we spend most of our time on, but is a decent amount, but not the whole time, is teaching.
Yeah, I definitely did not know that like half of your time is like dedicated to research, because I think most of us have like this like preconceived notion that like professors just teach most of the time. But
and it depends a little bit on the school. So there's some schools that are more research oriented. And then of course the goal is to eventually make the research guide the teaching. And so there's, it should be complementary, but the actual amount of time in front of students in the class is not, most of my day.
I see. Well, thank you so much for all of this insight, like both into your background and also your research. And one of our attendees has asked if you would be willing to share your slideshow with all of us.
Yeah, absolutely. Can I email it to you and then you can post it?
If you email it to me, I can send it out to everyone. And then, so there are still a few unanswered questions. And is it okay if I also give your email to everyone as well?
Yes, that'd be great. Yeah, if you email me, can you just say in the first line or the subject where the question's coming from? Just like say I was at the Econ Olympiad, so that I'll know.
Yeah, okay. So for you guys that still have questions, you guys can reach out to Professor Dinnerstein after our session too. Okay, so we have a raffle that'll be going on afterwards. And we can take a short break and then come back. So thank you so much again, Professor Dinnerstein. And we all really appreciated your talk for today.
Great. Thank you, everyone. I enjoyed it a lot.